Why is this team losing so much? Don't just say Embiid is out. He says it's got an all-star with Tyrese Maxey, and the rest of the players are widely believed to be good. Nurse is supposed to be a top-level coach, so why all the blowout losses?
I do believe part of it begins with what we discussed and what was the opening topic of our show. Tobias Harris plays a big part of that. You said that was Jay?
Yes.
Jay, I think Tobias Harris plays a big part of that. While he may not be the be-all, end-all of it all, he's a very important piece for what they have to do in order to be productive on the offensive end, and, of course, to have him rebound and play defense the way that he is capable of on the defensive side. So if you were getting the better version of the Tobias Harris, where we look at him for 2.5, 3 weeks of the scoring, the rebounding, and the overall play in general, where we're looking at him playing some pretty good two-way basketball for Nick Nurse's team, then I think we're talking about a different version of the Philadelphia 76ers, even without Joel Embiid, because that opens things up for Tyrese Maxey. And then it also goes down the line where you now have a player and what the things that he's able to do and Buddy Hield, it makes things easier for him too. And then when you start to get the other pieces coming into the game, it just simply works out that way. And then the other part is, I think this is something too, when you see some of the other players like a young Paul Reed and maybe a few of the other players, it puts them at ease too, knowing that they don't have to go up that extra level. You're already jumping into one level because Joel Embiid is not here. But when you have to go to another level because in the game and in the moment, Tobias Harris is not playing at that level, some are going to maybe overplay a certain way because they feel like they have to make up for what's not there right in that moment from what Tobias Harris is not doing. And that's a big part of what their success should be, Jay, if he is out there playing that two-way level of basketball. And even if he's not the greatest defensively on the other end, if he's giving you 20 points or 18 consistently for what Tyrese Maxey is already going to be giving you as a number one option, I think that's a big reason why.
Yeah. So here's one thing. There's a number of, a little scatterbrained right now, so there's a couple things I'm going to want to get to.
Mm-hmm.
They've played 11 games since Joel Embiid went out. Kelly Oubre and Paul Reed, they're the only two players that play 11 games. We just spoke earlier about how they're two of the players that we are most disappointed in. In terms of people who have played 10 games, you have KJ Martin, and the last one he just missed was last night. Mo Bamba, Ricky Council, and Tyrese Maxey. Okay, so of the players who have played either all of the games or one of the game, or only missed one game, only Tyrese Maxey is anything approaching a reliable player. You have, Tyrese Maxey missed the one game. Tobias Harris has missed 3 games. Buddy Hield has only played in 7 of the games. Where else do we have? DeAnthony Melton has played in 2 of the 11 games. Nick Batum has played in 2 of the 11 games. Or 3 of the 11 games, I'm sorry. You've got your core pieces outside of Joel Embiid who have missed a lot of games. So that's part of it. It's not just Embiid's health, it's that there have been a lot of players out.
Mm-hmm.
Second, and you sort of just brought this up, yeah, there's a lot of players on his team who are thought of relatively highly, but they're thought of relatively highly as role players, right? Nick Batum being maybe the perfect example, but even someone like Paul Reed, who we just talked about, and I think you brought up a good point. When Embiid's out, players try to do more. I think that is certainly true with Paul. I think when Embiid is out, Paul goes, well, I've got to try to score more. I've tried to do more, when really it's, you've just got to play your role for longer. But I think getting that through to a young player is tough, especially someone like Paul, who always has, moments where he thinks he's the center of attention or the main character in a story.
Right.
And you've got players, a lot of the role players, who are, their value, like Batum, is derived off of catch and shoot. Even someone like DeAnthony, they're all players who need space created for him. With Joel Embiid out of the lineup, there's really no one outside of Tyrese Maxey. And Tyrese Maxey, we haven't been focused on it too much because there's been so many other problems. He's not a natural high-level shot creator at this point. I think he's made progress. I think he's better than I expected, but he's not where he's going to be at 28, and he's probably not, where you necessarily need him to be.
Mm-hmm.
So with so many players having to play out of their role and not getting shots created for him, it makes those players who were previously thought of as high level down a notch or two because they're just playing roles they're not necessarily comfortable doing. And then you've got Tobias Harris, he's the one player who you go, all right, Embiid's out, we need you to step up and be consistent. And not only has he has been consistent, the problem is he's been consistently bad. So all of that is, and they're playing now their toughest stretch of games throughout the season. this is, I know we've had, I think it is Neil in the chat who's been talking pretty much the entire time. None of this matters because it's all about Joel Embiid getting back healthy. And certainly when you're talking about the team playing well in the playoffs, I think that's mostly true. Why this matters now is because they are in that fight to stay out of that play-in tournament. And because even if Joel Embiid comes back, being in a spot where you have to win 2 out of 3 games or 1 out of 3 games, where basically a 2-game losing streak could end your season, is never something it's not a position you want to be in. You want to avoid that at all costs. So this matters because seeding matters. This matters because the play-in matters. But his overall point of Joel Embiid changes everything, I think, is largely true. And this is a team where they have either because they're trying to keep their trade chips for a big move, or because they want to get role players who fit alongside of Embiid. This is a team where so many of the players are context dependent, where they have to be in the right spot next to Embiid rather than guys who can really elevate their games. They don't have a James Harden like they had last year to sort of run so much offense. Will that be the smart move? Well, that in part depends on how well they complement Joel Embiid when he comes back. That in part depends on what Daryl Morey does with the draft picks and the cap space in the summer. But the reality is they just don't have very many players who can elevate into a larger role and assume that playmaking responsibility. And the one guy that they do have is having a disappearing act. So it's sucks, but it is where we are.
And with his disappearing act, it also, when we talk about, of course, it's Joel Embiid, Neil's absolutely right. But to the earlier point about having much better role players, especially when you have an all-star player who's really elevated his play to still be the number one guy and can get you 20 consistently, he may have to really search far and wide for that in certain games. But if the number two didn't have the disappearing act, I think it changes a lot of things. And then think about this too, Neil and others, is that if Harris was playing at that level, Nurse wouldn't have to tinker the way that he does have to tinker. We've seen him benched already for Ricky Council against the Washington Wizards. And even, what was that? Was that the Cleveland game or was that the game against, it was the Cleveland game where the Sixers made their run when he was on the bench. And Nurse left him on the bench for a good amount of time. And then he had to go back to him because he is who he is. The profile is what it is. And quite frankly, the other guys probably weren't going to be able to sustain it to close the game out. So you had to do that. So Nurse has to make certain decisions on when to put him in, when to leave him in, when to take him out, because he's just simply not playing at the level and the standard that we expect and that they expect from him as well. And it's tough to be, once again, in this spot to be talking about him the way that we do, but he has done this. As Derek mentioned very, very early in the show, in order for this to work and answer the question of how does Nick Nurse get him out of this slump and to be better, he has to be the one to get out of that slump and be better. Not Nurse, not Maxey, who took the blame of not having Tobias Harris get off a little bit more in terms of, being a much better scorer in the games. He has to be the one to dig deep and get that back for this basketball team over this final stretch while Joel Embiid is back, because when he does come back, now you're putting that pressure on the big fella to maybe push it a little bit more than he needed to, because they didn't give him the necessary gap in space to just simply come back and ease himself back into it, instead of putting the pedal to the floor to get them to that 6 seed. And instead, we're probably looking at a team that's going to be really fighting for that 6th spot. And most likely, folks, being in that play-in tournament, to be quite honest with you, with the way that it looks like things are going.
We all silly like the mayor.